Gary. I'm the Community Outreach and Research Coordinator at the Hauenstein Center, and I'd like to welcome you to our inaugural Coffee House debate. Before we get started, I would like to give a special thank you to Grand Valley State University, our generous donors, specifically Ralph W. Hauenstein, and our community partners such as the Dire Eyes Foundation. Today's debate is part of the Common Ground initiative at the Hauenstein Center. The initiative is unique in higher education today. No other university in the U.S. is offering a balanced, comprehensive exploration and redefinition of what it means to be conservative and progressive today. With the recent government shutdown and today being election day, debating the role of government in the United States seems extremely topical. However, unlike the elections today, the point of this debate is not to declare a winner and a loser. Although, knowing our two debaters, I'm sure they'll both be declaring victory tomorrow in the office. Today's debate is about fostering understanding and openness in our community. Our Common Ground initiative reinforces the Hauenstein Center's mission to create ethical and effective leaders in public service that Ralph Hauenstein exemplified throughout his life. Now I'd like to introduce one of our emergent leaders, Jason Escarino, who is today's moderator.
Hi everybody. I'm going to start with a brief introduction of both of our speakers, and then I'll explain how we're going to proceed. First, Mark Hoffman is an associate professor of public administration and the director of the School of Public, Nonprofit, and Health Administration. Dr. Hoffman teaches public and nonprofit administration courses and information technology geographic information systems courses. Dr. Hoffman is published in Administrative Theory and Praxis, Government Information Quarterly, Public Voices, and Public Administration Review. He has also co-authored and authored a number of book chapters. He received the 2002 William and Frederick Mosher Award for Best Article by an academic appearing in Public Administration Review. Dr. Hoffman has been the director of SBNHA since 2007. Dr. Hoffman spent his 2011-12 sabbatical year teaching in South Korea and Poland. Prior to joining the faculty at GVSU in 1999, Dr. Hoffman was a research associate with the Urban Center at Cleveland State University. He received his PhD from the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. He has a master's in urban studies from Cleveland State and a Bachelor of Arts in political science from the College of Worcester. And now Professor Robbins. Donijo Robbins DeJonge is professor of public finance with the School of Public, Nonprofit, and Health Administration here at GVSU. She is an unabashed fiscal conservative and believes balanced budgets should be a national priority. Professor Robbins teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in public budgeting, public finance, and research methods. She has authored and co-authored a number of journal articles and book chapters. Professor Robbins is an officer with the Association for Public Budgeting and Finance, a member of the Government Finance Officers Association, the ICMA, the American Society of Public Administration, and the American Kennel Club. Professor Robbins holds a PhD in Public Administration and an MA in Economics from Rutgers University, Newark, and a BS in Economics and Political Science from Central Michigan University. So those are our two guests. I've been fortunate enough to be a student for both of them. They're wonderful professors. The way this is going to work is we're going to give each speaker 7.5 minutes for opening comments, and then they're each going to have a 5-minute rebuttal. And then after that, they're going to have 7.5 minutes of questioning each other, and then we'll open up for Q&A from the audience. So if we can begin with Professor Robbins.
Hoffman.
Dr. Hoffman.
I defer. So we found our common ground. I go first. How is that? Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not used to talking to people who have to pretend that they're interested in what I'm saying in the classroom. To start off, let me just talk about my own intellectual journey, how I came to believe what I believe. When I was in college, undergraduate, I was at the College of Worcester. I was sort of a peace and justice Catholic at that time. I was at a Presbyterian school It was the 1980s, so there were still lots of Marxists around, as well as Ronald Reagan Republicans. So debate was very lively, and I tended never to fit in with either crowd, even though I was a political science person. And I wound up in lots of arguments with the Marxists, who I thought were, very oblivious to the fact that, their theory didn't seem to pan out in the Soviet bloc or Cuba or Africa, and they were very dogmatic and would, just had their single solution to all problems. I was the business manager of the college newspaper when it was run by the leader of the Young Republicans. All the rest of the staff were extremely right-wing Reagan Republicans. I was the token Democrat, the business manager, which of course is very ironic. The leftist political science student was the business manager of the right-wing newspaper, which was being written by people from the econ and business departments. So, but anyway, so my experience of being, going way back to college days, of being in these kind of debates, although, in my mind, there should be someone over on my left. I'm in the middle, right? But, so that's how I see myself. But over time, this has changed. I mean, I think that, at least my observation is that the conservative Republicans or fiscal conservatives or free marketers, they have become like the new Marxists, right? They have these easy solution, at least in my mind, a very dogmatic solution, won't accept pragmatic compromises or look at the data. They already have all the answers, and so therefore they become very difficult to argue with. I don't put my colleague here in that camp, but I would say that is my observation, that's how things have changed. I think the charisma of Ronald Reagan, the fall of the Berlin Wall, really changed the entire intellectual conversation and changed the way these kind of debates happen. So I'd like to start by mentioning something that I mentioned at the beginning of most of my classes, is that that we were born an anti-government country, and this still remains part of our cultural DNA. The body of our Declaration of Independence is a list of complaints against the colonial administration. The British government, quote, sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out our substance. And about a dozen years later, our founders designed the Constitution to prevent the type of administrative tyranny that they experienced under colonial rule. So, given this history, I think it is natural and healthy that we will look with some suspicion on government, and that we're very sensitive to incidents of waste, corruption, and red tape. But because of this, I think we tend to be oblivious to the successes and the benefits of government. So I think in this country, every day, we take for granted that we can drink tap water without becoming ill. We can mail a package without it being opened. We can get a building permit without bribing an official. We can work in a factory that is not a dangerous fire trap. We can access our government's data and information. We can go outside without wearing a mask. We can enjoy our own homes because our neighbors can't run a motorcycle repair shop or chicken farm in a residential neighborhood. We can get help supporting our elderly parents. We could get help paying our bills if we're temporarily unemployed, and we can go to the store without passing dozens of children begging for food. We take these successes for governments, which not all governments around the world would be able to provide, but we take them very much for granted. And we look at the revitalization of downtown Grand Rapids, and of course we attribute it to the very generous donations of our local philanthropists. And certainly it's true, the DeVos family did contribute about 7% of the development for DeBoss Place, and the Van Andel family did contribute about 15% of the cost of the Van Andel Arena. And the Friends of Bill Seidman did contribute an amazing 60% of the cost of the building we're not in. And this is incredible and wonderful, and we honor these people, by naming buildings after them. But then we tend to forget that behind all of this, there was also a lot of public contribution to these projects. And without the government, and without that contribution and involvement of the government, this revitalization wouldn't have happened. And just like we like our philanthropists, we like our nonprofit organizations. We sometimes don't tend to notice that all the good work of our nonprofit organizations, a lot of it is also funded by government. 1.4 million nonprofit organizations receive some government funding, including, and I went through some annual reports last night just to see what this might amount to, Girl Scouts Heart of West Michigan, less than 1% of their budget from the government. United Networks for Organ Sharing, they're the ones that manage the organ transplants and for people needing transplants, 7% from the government. Habitat for Humanity, 26%. Wellandplex, 50%. Meals on Wheels, 60%. Catholic Charities of West Michigan, 75% operating budget coming from government grants and contracts. So again, a lot of what the government does, I think, becomes invisible to us. So it becomes very easy to sort of dismiss what the government does and just say, well, if we got rid of government, not much would be affected. But I think, in reality, an awful lot would be affected.
There's one more minute, Dr. Hoffman.
Okay, one more minute. Next slide. Look at this. Can I buy some minutes? This way. See, I want this taken off my time. Okay, top button. Okay, Donijo is going to have lots of charts and graphs for you. I have a few pictures, okay? And the pictures are to remind you of what I want you to remember. Baby in a box, government programs sometimes can be the most economical and effective solutions, and only ideology gets in the way. Bear on ice, ideology will sabotage good decision making, and your favorite musician, Psy, limited government and low taxes. The idea that limited government and low taxes create wealth and prosperity is only a theory. Now, I don't know how. 30 seconds, wow. In Finland, in 1936, they had a problem. They had a problem of high infant mortality. And the government went and tried to figure out what to do. And what they did was, they created a program where women could get this box of gifts. Baby clothes, formula, things like this, and also the box itself could actually be used as a bag. And to get this box, the women, they could get this box if they went to see their doctor in the first 4 months of pregnancy, right? So this got women, encouraged them to go to the doctor, and therefore get the kind of medical treatment that would help and reduce the chance of infant mortality. And what do we see? What do we see happen? Well, in Finland, infant mortality started falling. I mean, there's the warriors there, but it fell and fell and fell. And right now, Finland, of all the developed countries, it has the second lowest infant mortality rate, much better than the United States. They did it with a very simple mechanism, and it was very effective. And there was a 75-year anniversary of this event, and so it got some press. And when you go online and look at the press articles, you will see underneath many of the conservative trolls, whatever you call those people that like to comment on articles, complaining, oh, this was just a trick to get women involved with the state. It, you know, should have been left to the free market. It's such a horrible idea, etc. So ideology, you know, says that we should do this, even though it was a very simple, effective government way to solve the problem. Can I buy 2 minutes? Skip the polar bear on ice. Okay, fine. We'll go to the last one. And that is Psy. What is this guy dancing about? You probably have all heard the song from 2 years ago, whatever, Gangnam Style. What you might not realize is what he's doing. He is actually, it's a parody mocking people that live in a relatively wealthy suburb of Seoul. And the odd thing here is that there is even such thing as a wealthy suburb of Seoul, because in 1960, South Korea, was one of the poorest countries on the planet, right? It had the GDP of Ghana. The American advisors that went over there to try to help the government, they basically said, well, you have no natural resources, you have a poorly educated population, your only future is to produce rice for the Japanese market. This was what the American economists told them. And yet, today, the South Koreans, okay, you might be familiar with some of these brand names. They are now flooding the American market, right? South Korea has become the single greatest success story, okay, of economic development on the entire planet. And if you said, well, this must have been done by the invisible hand, by completely free market, you would find that that isn't at all the case. It is true that they did go socialist, because countries that went socialist did not succeed. But the South Korea, it's not the invisible hand, it's the hand of this guy there, Park Chung-hee, who was their dictator for about 20 years. And Park Chung-hee set up a system where the government controlled all the credit in the country by nationalizing the banks and plus the money the government had available. And he picked winners and losers. He went to specific companies like Samsung, which at the time made rice. That's what Samsung did. They made rice. And he said, you can have access to credit, but in exchange for that, you have to make wires. Okay? And the government did that over and over, interfering in the market, telling companies what they needed to produce in order to get this credit. And the government set up protective tariffs to help to protect the products that those companies were going to make, and prevented foreign businesses from coming in to buy them or setting up competition. And in exchange, those companies did the bidding of the government, created steel plants, created auto plants, etc., overemployed people. He was a dictator. He needed lots of employment. So they overemployed people and also kicked back plenty of political money so he could do things that he couldn't do with legitimate government money. But my point is that what you have, the result is that Korea, that's the GDP over time, from 69, I think. Okay, one of the most astounding increases in GDP. And if you look at Chile, which is often, Chile, after the Pinochet was overthrown, Chile became the Chicago school economists from the U.S. went down, helped the Chilean economy turn into a rather, radical free market type economy. And it did do badly. Here is the parallel to Chile. It did do badly on that program, but it didn't do nearly as well as South Korea did using a mixed market type economy. So, and on top of it, the other amazing thing that South Koreans did under this heavy-handed government is they produced the most equitable distribution of income of any industrial country on the planet. So that they have fewer richer and fewer poor people, okay, than other developed countries. And you can see Chile is way down at the bottom of the list, and we're not near the top either. So two amazing achievements done under a very, very activist government. So my point is that that although we tend to believe that, of course, low taxes and limited government lead to all good things. I think that if you try to look at evidence, you don't necessarily see that that is the case. Now, I'm sure I went at least 5 minutes over, so.
So 2 minutes. Thanks, Mark.
I deficit top, just like
Yeah,
I deficit
you did.
spending, so I deficit top.
Have you been doing it, or that was fine. You can move back. Thanks. So thanks to Glades and the Hauenstein Center for putting this event together, and thanks to Mark. And I'm not real sure why I actually agreed to this, but I'm here now. So this past summer, Glades talked to us and said, let's put this debate together and talk about the question, is the federal government too big? And my answer is simply yes. So I'll give it. No. So why do I say that government is too big? Well, let me take a step back and define first what I mean by size and scope of government. So if we just talk about size of government, I think we can define size of government by expenditures and revenue that the federal government brings in and spends. So that will be the size of government. And when we talk about the scope, let's say that the scope of government is the intervention of government into the economy or our lives. And I believe that government, there are really 4 policy areas that government does this through allocation, meaning they supply goods and services, trash collection, water, and sewer. And I'm not suggesting that those are good or bad things, but those are the roles that they take. Redistribution of wealth is another one, where they take from those who have and give to those who have not. They try to stabilize the economy through tax and spend policies, through monetary policy, and then they also like to regulate everything that we do, I think. The chair that I'm sitting in, I'm sure, is regulated the material so it doesn't burst into flames, and the lights that are on in this room are probably regulated by the government to tell us what kind of bulb we have to use. So they are in our lives everywhere. I don't think we dismiss that.
And the chair is very comfortable.
It
So
is.
I compliment the government on its regulation.
And we're not going to start on fire, so that's fantastic. So I think the size and scope, although we can define them separately, they are really quite, they intertwine, they're not mutually exclusive. And as government grows, the scope of government, as it becomes more involved in our lives, of course, expenditures will grow. So why am I a fiscal conservative? Well, if we track back to the Constitution that Mark mentioned, although it might be a list of complaints, I believe that it is a contract from the states with the federal government, where it says, hey, we believe you, federal government, to have these items, that this is what you can do. We enumerate powers to them, and everything is left to the states or the people. So really to the subnationals, and that's to our 10th Amendment. And I believe that really it's the subnational governments that do best for its citizens. They understand its constituents, and then rather than having a USA university, we have GVSU University, right? And we know our constituents, and we can make this university great. Although it's a public school, that's fine, but we know our constituents, and we can make this university great by understanding our constituents. So really what has come out of our system is this unique system that no other country has. Korea doesn't have this, Chile doesn't have this, Chile doesn't have this. It's this dual federalism. Not dual Hamilton-Burr, dual, which is really what's happening today, probably, and I'll get to that, but dual meaning a decentralized model where the federal government will do something, and then the rest is left for the states. And again, I believe that that's where we serve the citizens best. So, but I think that the government, if I can just go to my slides here real quick, does this even work? Or are you just moving? Okay, so I'm not even going to bother with that. So,
we need a little more regulation.
So, in terms of just the size and scope of the federal government, this is mandatory spending. So, the federal government has taken an activist role, and you can see from the 1962 to 2012. See that from discretionary spending, which is really what Congress argues every year about is discretionary spending. Those 13 appropriation bills, the reason why government shut down is that discretionary spending. Well, it's a very small piece of the pie now. It is less than 40%, and mandatory expenditures have to be fixed, per se, re-legislated, right? They have to write additional legislation for Medicaid, for Medicare, for Social Security. So you can see that mandatory spending has become relatively large. And of course, when you look at this slide, this is just the receipts. Mandatory receipts, Social Security receipts, are not large enough to sustain the growth in the mandatory expenditures. And if you were paying attention to the lower, whatever side that is for you, the right side of the graph for 2012, you can see that the receipts is $2.45 trillion, and we're spending over $3 trillion. So we have an issue with our expenditures outweighing. But really, so the federal government taking this activist rule, you can see that the transfer of payments to individuals, it has increasingly become retirement and medical care. And that is no surprise to anybody. Those are the big topics of the day. And this is really where I believe we have to find the common ground. So the growth, just the sheer growth, the payments to individuals is the red line. I know those are hard to see. Defense is the dashed green line, and the interest, and that interest is another dashed line down there at the bottom. So mandatory expenditures, those that we are responsible for, the red line and the dotted black line, we have to pay for those, right? We have legislation to do that. Discretionary is everything else, which is defense. So we could wipe out defense, and we could get rid of the education spending and the EPA, and we still would not have a balanced budget. Next slide, please. And so those are the magnitudes of our deficits. And then I don't have a slide for our debt, but our debt is $17 trillion. And my point here is that we have a $17 trillion debt. When we add the unfunded liabilities from Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, we're at about $175,000 per person in this country. And that's massive. And is it unsustainable? Probably yes. What do we need to do to fix it? Well, perhaps Mark and I can talk about that. But really what this does is, I said dual federalism at the beginning. We have moved to a dual, D-U-E-L, federalism system where a lot of the responsibilities from the federal government, while they write the laws, they devolve the responsibility to state and local government. So the federal government writes the legislation about insurance, unemployment insurance, but then it's up to the state to make sure that they can provide that service to people who are unemployed. And while that might be nice from local constituents, we understand our needs, it becomes very difficult. It places an undue burden on local and state governments. So how can we make it work? Where's the common ground? Next slide, please. I think perhaps Loretta and Leroy Lockbourne might have best solved the problem. This was just in Sunday's Funnies. It's my favorite part of the paper. And I'm so glad they print it still. But you can see where they're trying to balance their revenue and expenditures just in their own home. So if they can do it, I'm certain that the federal government might be able to do it. But if we just, a couple of suggestions I might provide. One, the role of accounting has been quite substantial in helping us solve problems over time. We've made government, I believe, more professional and accountable by establishing certain rules. We really have to stop the sensationalism, what Mark really pointed to, the sensationalism of these comments. I think we have an initial reaction to something awful, and we try to create policy without really understanding the cause and effect. So I would say that our infant mortality rate, of course, we need some work in this country. We are not ranked as good as somewhere like Finland or other places. However, I don't think that the baby in the box is the reason why. Because when you look at the United States, our infant mortality went on the same trajectory down without a box and a blanket. But perhaps it's caused the fact. I don't know. I'd have to look at the research. And from a public administration point of view, that's what Mark and I both are. We're public administrators. We've been trained in that field. And I think we have a lot of work to do where we have a systems failure. We have to figure out how we can get our administrators, our managers, to be able to make these decisions and make them well. So we're not putting this burden on the future society. Because when we borrow $17 trillion, we're borrowing from the future. We're borrowing from somebody in the future so we can pay for stuff today. And that's unsustainable. And perhaps the final piece that I would offer for common ground is just this dialogue. We used to have a dialogue from the subnational and national levels. The federal government and state governments had a committee that existed. It's all but disappeared, and there's no more conversation between the two levels. So I would really like to see that dialogue reemerge, and if the federal government can really understand what happens to state governments when they pass legislation, that might be more helpful.
Thank you both. Now we'll have 5 minutes to go. Dr. Hoffman.
Here's where I'll try to make up and make it 2 minutes to make up for my run over last time. I don't disagree about the balanced budget. I mean, I think we agree we should be balancing the budget. And we might disagree on how to balance the budget, because I don't necessarily agree that the whole problem is that we are providing too many services. The problem may also be that we're not providing enough revenue to cover the services. We need to have a balanced budget. The programs that Donijo mentioned, I would point out, the Social Security, unemployment, Medicare, these are really group insurance, right? It's not really so much the idea of a transfer of wealth. And so they should all be somewhat self-sufficient. So when we hear the word transfer of wealth, I think we often think, well, it's always taking, the purpose of the program is to take money from wealthy people and give it to poor people. But when you really look at the budget, only about 6% of the budget is truly going to what you say the non-working poor, the programs that are specifically for non-working poor. And another 1% is foreign aid. Okay, and for whatever reason, we don't want to get into debate on foreign aid, but it's only 1% of the budget, but you could say it's to transfer money to poor countries or something like that. So basically, 7% of the budget is intended to be a pure transfer of wealth from haves to have-nots. The rest of it, as I say, is mostly an attempt to have a group insurance plan. That's it. I'll probably do 3 minutes of the 2, I promise.
On that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if we go back to Mark's opening comments, he made a lot of comments about good government, and I believe in good government. And I don't think any fiscal conservative would reject government. That's not what we do. We just believe in good government, efficient, effective government. And at the federal level, I think that often, well, not often, I think it was built to be inefficient and ineffective, right? We have 3 branches of government. It wasn't intended to be this large, but now we have other things that we do, the transfer of wealth, call it what you will, insurance payments. It's taxes on payroll. So it's the working people pay these taxes. Non-working people don't pay the taxes. And of course, that includes children and retirees. So that's okay, right? We have rules against employing children. But what I would say is that an activist government or a redistribution of wealth also creates perhaps bad policy. Bad policy is written where you can have rent seekers and you make the policy very vulnerable to this type of behavior. And the people who write these laws are exactly the ones who get the benefit from the laws. And I don't like that. So if you're going to make a policy, make it where the writers of the laws actually have to conform. So Congress, for example, recently wrote themselves out of the Affordable Care Act. They don't have to participate. And Harry Reid was just asked the other day, are you going to have your staff sign up for the Affordable Care Act? And he said, I'm trying to follow the law as closely as I can. And I thought, well, I'm going to use that the next time I get pulled over for speeding. I'm trying to follow the speed limit as closely as I can, officer. Is that okay? I'm sure I'll still get a ticket, right? Although there are others from the left and the right that are putting their staff into affordable care, which is great. That's what they should do. But they also created laws where they were not subject to insider trading rules. That's now changed, but Martha Stewart went to jail for this. And if she were in Congress, she would not have gone to jail because of insider trading. So when they make the laws, when they exempt themselves, I have an issue with it. I'll stop. We have time for questions now.
Well, we have some time for you guys to ask each other a few questions. Have an interactive dialogue.
Okay.
Let's search for common ground.
Okay.
When in the White House, Republicans tend to deficit spend almost as liberally as Democrats, but on items that most please their constituents, such as defense spending and tax breaks. When out of power, Republicans make balancing the budget through cutting spending their #1 priority. Is the urgency for a balanced budget genuine, or just a ploy to force austerity on Democratic administration so as to hinder the Democrats from pleasing their constituents with items such as expanded health care, education, and welfare benefits? Will this urgency for a balanced budget subside as soon as a Republican is in the White House and wants to be able to hand out candy to his or her constituents?
So I counted 4 questions. How long do I have to answer? So yeah, I would say there's both groups like their candy shop, right? They like their different sections. So I don't think we can isolate it as a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. I think we try to please our constituents, and that's to be expected. That's what they do. But what can be done, right? This is the common ground, perhaps, that we need to reach. Well, I would say there's a number of things that we have to do to reach a common ground where we don't run into these problems of massive deficit spending or huge debt. First, I would say that, well, we have a 55,000-page tax code. Perhaps we could reform the tax code, because I don't think that creates a level playing field, and I don't like it when government policies pick winners and losers. And I think that's exactly what they do from either side. So perhaps if we reform our tax code, and I don't know who understands 55,000 pages of anything, but I was actually I was thinking about bringing all the books that I had for 55,000 pages, but it was too much to carry. Just to show how much 55,000 pages looks like. But I would say we need to reform our tax code significantly, because there's even tax issues, and they're thinking of mortgage deduction. And although this is controversial, or the deduction for nonprofit charitable donations. So the idea is we can take away those, and we'll give government more money. In fact, all of those tax expenditures account for $1 trillion tax expenditures. So the government is giving up $1 trillion through credits and deductions. So imagine if we reformed the tax code, reduced the taxes, and got rid of all those deductions and credits. Your effective tax rate would probably be just about the same, but the marginal tax rates would be substantially lower, and a much easier tax code for everybody to understand. Second, I think one of the reasons why government gets into this role at the federal level is a law that is nearly as old as I am, from 1974, the Congressional Budget and a Budget Control and Impoundment Act. And it has now set the stage for the way they act in Washington, and it allows them to shut down government if they don't come to a decision. It makes supermajorities necessary to pass certain legislation. And I think from that standpoint, we really need to reform the 1974 legislation. Pieces of it have been, but I think that needs to be completely redone. In fact, it was a major conversation at the conference I was just at in October. The 1974 piece of legislation has got to be redone. And a balanced budget amendment. There's always been talk about a balanced budget amendment, and I know probably Mark will say, well, what about within emergency times? You could make it handle emergency times, and we could figure out a way so we don't deficit spend time and time again with such an amendment. About that?
No.
You agree with everything I say? That can't be possible.
Within the time limit we have, you can go ahead and ask your question to me.
Okay. Mark, fact. The top 25% income earners, which starts at an income of $66,193, pay approximately 87% of the federal income tax. So my question to you is, the federal government clearly disproportionately taxes what we would call the wealthy, which starts at $66,000. I don't call the wealthy $66,000, but it disproportionately spends on the poor. So how is this redistribution of wealth fair?
Well, I think when you look at, you could play with these numbers, but the thing is, we're looking at income tax, right? So we're looking strictly at income tax. if you looked at the entire tax burden, right, which includes sales tax and property tax, some taxes which are much more regressive, right, instead of progressive, you would find that the numbers don't look nearly as redistributed. Now, the thing is, it's very hard to estimate. Income tax is easy. The other taxes, adding them all up and figuring what people pay is a very academic process. But something like the top 20% of income earners make about 59% of the income, and in total taxes they pay about 64% of all taxes. So 59 to 64 is not as outrageous. I mean, yes, they're paying a little bit more, but not that much more that it seems to be that incredibly burdensome. The other things, as you said, you used the word wealth, and that would be the other way to look at it. You know, wealth. Wealth would be looking at basically the marketable assets that someone owns minus their debt. And if you looked at that, you would see that about the top 1% of households own about 35% of all privately held wealth, and the next 19% have about 53%. So all in all, the top 20% own about 89% of all wealth in the country. And they're certainly not paying 89% of the tax burden. So I don't think that the tax burden in this country is really all that skewed to be unfair to the people, either the wealthier people or the people with higher incomes. The other thing I would say is you also have to note that our income distribution is somewhat skewed. So we saw Korea being much more equitable distribution, and in other countries with a more equitable distribution, they don't have to tax the wealthier so much more because there aren't so many wealthy and they don't make such a large proportion of the income and wealth. So it's easier to not do that. So if you actually look, at a country that the right, usually countries that the right usually deride, like Denmark and Sweden, you would see that actually their tax burden, on the rich, and so is more balanced than ours is. But then they don't have quite as many rich people. So that's how I would respond. I think in redoing the tax code, this is one of the things that makes it very difficult, because when we sit down and say we're going to redo the tax code, everyone is a potential winner or loser, right? No matter what you do, you go flat tax, you go all sales tax, you do all of these things, right? There's going to be, everybody's going to look at it and say, how am I going to be better off or worse off? And I think you're going to see the positions that people take is basically going to be very strongly in self-interest. We need to do this. I think it's going to be very, very hard, and there is a reason it's always pushed off into the future.
Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Hoffman and Professor Robbins. I'd like to take a few moments to get some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
I'd like to direct this to either of you both. Is the tax... Oh, I thought maybe I could be heard.
We can hear you.
I can talk up.
The video can't hear you.
Okay. I'll direct this question to either or both of you. You've talked a lot about tax and redistribution and its effect on the economy in several countries, including the United States. And is the tax viewed by either of you as a kind of an envy tax? That is, those who've got it better give it up. Or is it considered a tool of revenue in which quite often, in fact, John F. Kennedy used it very effectively in lowering the tax rate to raise the revenue. And that's historically true, and many people are citing now on both sides as being an ideal way of raising revenue by lowering taxes, because more activity is created through the loosening up of funds. And you don't have to worry how they're going, the sureness of whether they're going to be taxed or not. Neither one of you, I'd like to have your reply to that.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, for the first part, philosophical of why do we pay tax? I'm trying to remember the way you phrased it, but I don't think it's an envy tax. I don't think it's just you have something and we're going to take it. It's not exactly just a pure way to raise revenue. That is, whatever is going to raise revenue is fine. I think basically the idea of a tax is that we have, you know, it's a duty. It's our collective duty, right? We have some obligation to support the collective good, because if whatever you're doing, your business is possible because you live in a society that basically supports, you know, your ability to do that business, right? You can't necessarily have run that business in Somalia because it doesn't have the government, there's no stability, etc., right? So I would say that simply a tax is part of one's civic duty to support our collective activities, and that's how I would see philosophically what a tax is.
Perhaps philosophically, but it's always been a revenue source to pay for stuff. If you look historically at the income tax at the federal level, they passed it to pay for wars, and then it would go away, and then it would come back, and then it would go away. And it was always based on population of the states. And then we passed the amendment, right, 1913, for the income tax. And the very first city in this country with an income tax was Philadelphia. And Philadelphia passed that income tax because they were on the verge of bankruptcy and they needed more money. And going to an income tax was a way to get money to balance their budget. So sometimes I think they might argue that it's an envy tax, right? We're going to take from some people. I think that's a very convincing argument with the 99%, right? The wealthy, they make a lot of money, they make a lot of money on the backs of other people, so we're going to take some of their money away. So perhaps some people argue that, but I think the original intention was simply to help pay for things that we cannot pay for to balance our budget. Because we use tariffs. We used tariffs way back when, right? And then the income tax became a way. It was never a way to redistribute wealth. It was always a tax to use to pay for goods and services.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask a question of both of you with regard to how difficult these problems are. You talk about we're embedded in a world that we just don't control in really many ways. I don't want to argue about whether or not our role should be as the lead nation among nations. I just want to point out something that's always frustrated me in the area of health, which is well known in my area, and that is that we pay 9% just this country, roughly. It's pretty close to all the development costs of pharmaceuticals. Both parties gave away all of that Medicare Part D without raising a dime of revenue. I'm not blaming the pharmaceutical companies, and I'm saying it should be non-profit. I'm just saying we bear that burden, and then we gave these medications to folks who are on Medicare, which I would argue was the right thing to do, oblivious to the fact that we're paying 9% plus of the development of drugs used by all 7 billion people. How do we just point that out? How do we get around problems? It's instructive all the time. And I would just point out that Mark missed the point that, well, a lot of tendency is to point out the good things money goes to. Both sides refuse to point out all the money in government that goes to the private for-profit sector.
I don't know how to solve that problem, how you can recoup those monies from overseas.
But I would say one of the things that I would like to see, it probably isn't on Donijo's list of reforms or things that we could do that might lead to solving the problem. I think that basically in our system, there's simply money needs too much, that it costs too much to run for office. This money needs to come from donors, and those donors then wind up having an awful lot of influence on legislation. So the pharmaceutical companies, I'm sure, take a lot of money and they donate it to people that are running for Congress, and therefore you're not going to get legislation that they're going to be very unhappy with, which means that if the United States were to try to take the track that the other countries, some sort of collective bargaining for their pharmaceuticals or whatever, that isn't going to happen here because that money talks too much. So I think that before we can get to tax reform and some other types of reform, and I don't have a good solution of what this would look like, but I think we have to get some of that huge money. Somebody running for Congress can't just be looking for how they're going to raise millions and millions and millions of dollars 2 years from now, even if they were just elected, because they're not going to be able to solve these hard problems because they have to pay too much attention to where they're going to get the money. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but I think that would be one of the things that would help solve some of the health issues, pharmaceutical issue, and some of the other issues that we have.
We have time for one more question.
What's your thought on sequestration?
You want to go, or I'll take this first. So, well, I think it just sheds more light on reform efforts from the 1974 legislation that we have to do something. Congress has not been able to pass their appropriation bills in a timely manner. This is not something new. This has been happening for 20 years. So something has got to be done. And in one respect, I like the sequestration because I know that they're not spending money that they don't have. So that's the bad part of it, though, right? But if we could just lock them in a room and make them come up to that's what I think of sequestration, right? They should lock them all in a room together and make them come up with a decision, and they can't leave until they have solved the problem.
And like the Vatican conclave, they can't talk to their potential donors about what to do while they're locked in the room. I think sequestration is a symptom of a growing dysfunction of legislatures, Congress, but even at the state legislatures. And I do think this is something that is very dangerous. I mean, basically, they couldn't come to something to do, they couldn't make a decision, so they wrote something where they didn't have to actually make any decisions about what programs should be cut or not cut. And I think that having a dysfunctional legislature is something very dangerous for democracy. I mean, people on the right often worry about, we're going to lose our democracy because the government's going to take our guns or something like that. I worry that we're going to lose our democracy because our legislatures become ineffectual, and that's how the Roman Republic fell, and the Polish Commonwealth fell basically because their legislatures became unable to solve the problems that were faced.
The question I have starts with a premise that you may or may not accept, and either one of you, but in searching for what I thought ought to be common ground among people like you and between the two of you, I start with the premise, and I'm old. I start with the premise that it's unfair for my generation to have charged my grandchildren a substantial debt. I wouldn't do it personally, and I don't think as a body politic we ought to do it. Now, can't there be common ground between the two of you that the situation that we're in on that issue ought to be solved?
I think it does have to be solved. And nobody seems to want to start that conversation. There's talk, I remember it came from Bill Clinton and George Bush, maybe we should privatize Social Security. And that freaked out people, and then the conversation was over, right? As soon as it started, it was over. So how can we solve the problem? I think balanced ground, common ground might be achieved in a couple of ways. Clearly, Social Security won't be there for my generation. I don't think it will be. I think eventually the cap will be removed, the tax for Social Security. We stop taxing at about $112,000 right now. So I think that cap will be removed. I think the tax will be reduced somewhat, and I think they'll end up means testing Social Security and take it back to what it originally was supposed to be, was to help the elderly so they weren't in poverty. The tax used to be 1%, and now it's 7.65%. Well, excuse me, it's 6.2% for Social Security for me and for Grand Valley. So there's 12.4% there. So I think a reasonable starting ground would be to start about removing the cap, changing the system for the younger generation, and probably end up means testing it. And whether we agree with that or not, but those are the 3 points that have to be discussed.
Well, I agree that balancing the budget needs to be done. My defense of government doesn't include a defense of not paying for government. So how do we get there? How do we make the politicians, do the right thing, and that is either decide that something is worth having and then creating the taxes or revenue to pay for it, or deciding that it's not worth it and then cutting it and getting rid of it. I think basically that's what they have to be forced to do, but it doesn't look like we're awfully close to getting them to do it.
Thank you everyone very much for coming. We'd like to give a special thank you to President Haas for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. We'd like to give a special thank you to our debaters, Mark Hoffman and Donijo, Robbins, DeJonge, for, if nothing else, showing us that it is possible for conservatives and progressives to share a stage and calmly discuss the issue. If you have evaluations for us, we would like to put them on the table. Thank you everyone for coming.